Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Screens and Mutable. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is my co-host, Federico Vitici. Hi, Federico.
Hey, John. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing really well. I was just looking today and realized that this is episode 21, and I still feel like we just got started, but I guess time flies, you know?
It feels like forever ago to me when we were launching this show and I was working on my iOS 11 concept video and story. And now iOS 11 is about to launch. We just got, last week we heard from Apple there's going to be an event on September 12th, and presumably iOS 11 is going to launch the week after. So we started with my concept, and we're now about 20 episodes in, and we're actually going to get iOS 11 soon enough. So yeah, time flies, especially when you're always launching new stuff and working on big reviews during the summer. You lose track of time, really.
Yeah, you do, especially this time of year. I mean, this is really when we're at our busiest. So why don't we dive in? We thought we would talk today about iTunes and where it stands today, because I think it's generally acknowledged by a lot of people that iTunes is getting a little long in the tooth, especially when you talk about iTunes on the Mac. I mean, obviously on iOS, there's not really an iTunes app. There's a bunch of different apps. But iTunes on the Mac really needs some work because it's been around forever. I mean, to put things in context, this app has been around since 2001. It came out of an app called SoundJam. And there's a great story that we'll put in the show notes that is from Cable Sasser at Panic, because Panic was approached at one point because they made an app, an MP3 player called Audion that Apple considered buying and was thinking about hiring the Panic guys in order to work on iTunes. That never worked out, and what Apple actually ended up doing was buying SoundJam in the summer of 2000. And in January of 2001, they debuted, or at least announced, iTunes, which came out later that year. And iTunes has been around then for, I guess it's been 16 years now. And that's and it's on Windows and it's on the Mac, and then the iPhone came later. That's a lot of years in terms of software. And it's been a lot of cruft that's kind of built up over time.
Yeah. And to be fair, iTunes did an excellent job 15 years ago. And especially after it launched on Windows, iTunes was the reason why Apple was able to reach a much wider audience with the iPod. iTunes democratized the process of organizing media on your computer. And over time, as it gained more features, today we even like to make fun of iTunes. But really back in the day, the fact that you could organize music and playlists and get all your movies and home videos into a single place and to sync that information, that media, to an iPod and later to an iPhone. That was amazing because it was so simple. In the days before cloud syncing, in the much before iCloud or Dropbox or all these other services, you could just plug in a cable, sync your information, and you could go with your iPod, with your iPhone, with your music, your calendars, and everything in one place.
Right.
The problem, I think, was twofold. As iTunes gained more and more functionalities, it became harder to use. But really, the core of the issue here is that the iPhone and the App Store ecosystem, as a result, and iTunes stopped at some point evolving together and moving in the same direction. iTunes was kind of stuck with an old model of you have a Mac, you have a PC, you keep your media on it, and then you sync information back and forth with your iPhone. And then the iPhone and the iPad and the entire iOS ecosystem, they started moving into the direction of everything's in the cloud. You don't necessarily own your media. You stream your media. You download your apps from the App Store. You sync your information directly between devices. You don't need the hub. You don't need the digital hub lifestyle because the hub is actually in the cloud. And everything that you need is seamlessly moved back and forth between devices. So at that point, maybe around 2010, when the iPad came about, when Apple launched iCloud in 2011 with iOS 5, it really became obvious that iTunes was starting to become a liability for Apple because it was an old model, and it was an app that was, it gained so many features that a lot of people didn't know what to do with it anymore. Apple tried to redesign iTunes. The redesign didn't really go well because a bunch of pro users in the process were kind of upset that they lost access to their favorite functionalities. And this is the classic example, I think, of feature bloat, that an app becomes so complex and so difficult to explain to new users that changing the app causes your existing users to be annoyed by change. And so you're stuck with this old program that doesn't necessarily evolve as the rest of the industry. And you reach a point where you need to split it up in some way. And that's what Apple has kind of been doing lately with iOS devices, with iOS apps. But the main problem remains that on the Mac, if you want to access the same features that iPhone and iPad users can rely on and access from dedicated applications, if you want to do the same on the Mac, well, you're just out of luck. You got to use iTunes.
Exactly. I mean, I think that you really hit it. I think you really hit it on the head, because iTunes was designed with music in mind. And over time, not only did the music industry change from a purchasing model to a streaming model, but iTunes gained all sorts of new functionality. It added TV shows, and it added movies, and it added books, and it added iTunes U, and it added ringtones. It went on and on and on. And it became this, and then apps, right? It became this one-stop shop for any kind of media you could ever want to use on your Mac. Whereas iOS, those things developed as separate standalone apps for the most part. Thanks to Screens for sponsoring App Stories this week. Screens lets you connect to your Mac from anywhere in the world. I love how easy it is to set up. I use it with a headless Mac Mini myself, but you don't have to. You can connect to any kind of Mac from anywhere you are. It supports secured connections with SSH tunnels for increased security, drag and drop files in order to transfer them between your Macs, and enable curtain mode to keep your Mac desktop hidden from others while you access it remotely. Screens has a special deal just for App Stories listeners. Use the promo code AppStories at checkout for 25% off the Mac version of Screens. Just go to edovia.com, that's EDOVIA.com, and use the promo code AppStories when you check out. Thanks again to Screens for supporting App Stories.
So if we take a look at iTunes on the Mac, aside from the fact that the interface is so complex, and just you look at the menu that contains all of the items that you can have in iTunes. I'm just going through the list now. Music, movies, TV shows, podcasts, iTunes U, apps, audiobooks, tones, which is still a thing, ringtones, internet radio, and shared libraries. These are a lot of items in a single application. And on macOS, there really isn't any other way to use these features outside of iTunes. On iOS, there's a dedicated TV app, which we'll get to in a minute. There's a podcasts client, there's an iTunes U app, and of course you download apps from the App Store, and audiobooks, you can access them from iBooks. But on the Mac, you can only do this stuff inside of iTunes. Even the Apple Music UI, which is completely different from what iTunes is buried into the music interface of iTunes. And this is all quite strange, because it means that iTunes holds access to different types of music. For example, streaming music, music you own as an iTunes Store music purchase, and even music that you've matched. So local music, like local music files that you probably carried over from an external drive or previous backups of your music library. These three types of albums and music are all contained within iTunes.
Internet radio is even still a thing in iTunes on the Mac,
What is internet radio? I don't even know.
Internet radio. Let me, I have to turn it on first in order to look at what it is. But internet radio it's different than what you get as part of an Apple Music subscription. It's just a bunch of streaming radio stations that are accessible by type of music in iTunes. They stream, but it's just a different kind of streaming, and they're free. So a lot of them tend to be actual radio stations. There are hundreds of them.
What's even stranger is that inside of iTunes, you have different types of iCloud-based products. So for example, Apple Music uses your iCloud account to sync your iCloud music library, which contains, for example, the songs you've loved in Apple Music, the stuff that you've added to your iCloud library. And so that information is contained within your Apple Music account. They use a specific portion of your iCloud information to sync that data between clients. But then you have podcasts, which uses a separate instance of your iCloud account to sync your subscriptions, the episodes you've listened to. And again, with iOS 11, podcasts is gaining a complete redesign. And on the Mac, it's still within iTunes. There's no dedicated podcasts app on the Mac. Even stranger is that Apple is slowly ditching the iTunes naming for most of their products. They're moving from the iTunes Music Store largely to Apple Music. If you follow Apple's social profiles on Instagram and Twitter, you know it's all about Apple Music. They don't really promote album releases on the iTunes Music Store anymore,
Right.
unless it's about exclusives or premieres. It's all about Apple Music. And Podcasts was renamed a few months ago from iTunes Podcasts to Apple Podcasts to refer this new identity, and now with iOS 11, this new design. But on the Mac, it's still inside of iTunes. And all these other things like ringtones and audiobooks, those are just odd because they don't necessarily need to be inside of iTunes, and yet they are because there's no other place where they could be on the Mac. And I feel like when Apple started offering iBooks purchases in a separate app with the iBooks app on the Mac, that was an encouraging sign of we're moving away from bundling up everything in iTunes and offering dedicated apps. But they kind of stopped there. I was really surprised when they didn't have a dedicated Apple Music player. It just doesn't make any sense to me that iTunes has to contain all of that streaming-based information when Apple could just make a leaner, more intuitive, faster, because one of the problems of iTunes is that it's so slow to launch and to operate. They could have a much faster and a more elegant Apple Music app, and yet still has to be used inside of iTunes.
Right. No, we're in a very strange place. And I think part of the reason for the strangeness is that there is a transition probably going to come soon. At least I sure hope there is, maybe in 2018, that does start to break some of this up. And one of the things we wanted to talk about was, how do you break all this up? How do you break it up and how do you make it work in a more cohesive way between Mac OS and iOS? There are a lot of different things going on in iTunes. And I think in order to have a coherent approach between macOS and iOS, one of the first things that needs to be addressed is, how do you divide up the content types? Because right now, at least on the Mac, everything is in iTunes. Video, and audio of all different types. And how do you split that apart? And I guess I'll start with video. I think that movies and TV shows, I think they probably still need to be called that because movies and TV shows are a familiar touchstone for people, but I don't think they should be mixed in with music at all. And I'd like to see something maybe a lot like the TV app that we have on iOS that brings together both movies and TV and perhaps even content from online, maybe even pull in subscribed channels from YouTube or from Vimeo or something like that.
That would be excellent to have like this all-in-one approach where you can combine videos from channels that you subscribe to, like in the TV app, where if you have cable and you have access to these paid for sources, and maybe, I know it's a long shot, but to have a native Apple integration with YouTube or with, for example, Twitch. If you could watch live streams from Twitch and YouTube, that would be also excellent. But really, if you look at stuff like Plex, for example, they have found success by integrating with these online sources as sort of plugins and native integrations, and then also allowing people to keep their local stuff. Because I think, especially for video, people like to, whether you want to rip your Blu-ray discs or you want to download stuff from other sources, people have huge libraries of home videos, so to speak. And to have an all-in-one approach with an Apple Videos app where you could have some degree of iCloud storage for your stuff, or maybe even music-like matching if possible. Or maybe if you want to skip the local storage altogether, just to offer an integrated way to buy content from iTunes, especially now that there's going to be supposedly 4K content on iTunes Store coming soon. and to bundle everything up with the TV app that Apple launched on iOS and tvOS. So you could have iTunes content, TV shows, movies, channels, maybe even YouTube. That would be excellent, I think, instead of having to have the inconsistency and the fragmentation, really, because it's all about the fragmentation of the TV app on iOS and tvOS, iTunes on the Mac, iTunes Store content that ends up on the Mac, but it's also available on iOS, sort of, if you look into your purchase history. I think a more integrated solution like Plex or like players for iOS, like Infuse, for example, where they bundle everything together, that would be really, really nice.
Yeah, the other thing I'd like to see is kind of an aside, and maybe this is something that's more important with music, but one thing I know with music in particular and podcasts too, that I any kind of audio really, that I'd like to see is when you say I'm out listening to music on my headphones using my iPhone and I come home, I'd like to be able to do some sort of handoff, whether that's handoff to a Mac, handoff to the Apple TV. And I think that would work with video too. You know, maybe you're watching something at your desk on YouTube or Twitch and you want to go to your TV, and it's something different than just AirPlay. I don't think AirPlay is great, but it's not the solution for this kind of thing. I think it's more in the nature of the handoff and continuity features that we see for things like handing off web pages when you're using your iPhone.
AirPlay 2, which is launching with iOS 11, could be used, though, as the backbone for this functionality, especially if you consider that there's native multi-room audio support in AirPlay 2. So if you consider multi-room, or if you apply that reasoning to multi-device, you could have a single data stream moving across, your MacBook and your iPhone, your iPad, and your Apple TV, and in the future, even your HomePod. So that I'm still not used to that name, by the way, HomePod.
I know.
So in theory, that should be possible if Apple wants to extend AirPlay 2. I also like I want to go back quickly to the idea of, because we talked about video, I want to talk about music.
Mm-hmm.
Again, just quickly, I don't think it makes any sense that Apple Music at least needs to be into iTunes. There should be a separate Apple Music or a separate music app on macOS that is solely dedicated to managing music, whether it's your online Apple Music subscription or your local music stuff. Just get rid of iTunes, create a new music management interface, make it a standalone music app, and I feel like that would remove a lot of the complexity that is currently experienced by many people in the iTunes UI.
Yeah, but would you put the purchased music and the streaming in there, or would you just separate out the streaming stuff? How would you handle kind of that? Because there's that weird split, right? You have stuff. You have a store where you can buy things and a place where you can stream things, and then you have this mishmash of what's in your library.
So realistically, what I would do is I would have two separate libraries.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think mixing the online library with the actual library has worked in Apple's favor. I think I would want to have like your Apple Music library and call it, I don't know, your personal library or your iTunes library or whatever. Just have two clearly communicated separate views or separate libraries. Just a way to say, okay, let me see the streaming stuff that I've added to my collection, and let me see the stuff that I've bought. I would play them back within the same app. I just wouldn't mix the two libraries.
The one place I could see that you would still want to mix them, though, is things like playlists, right? You create a playlist of something that you only have flagged as something that you want downloaded from streaming,
right.
But also something you own. So that I think is one place where I think I would mix them.
And there's probably really not a perfect way to deal with this, as long as Apple maintains two separate options, which is streaming and purchasing. And I don't think that is going away anytime soon, but I also believe that the same item, the same song, if it comes from two different sources, there should be some kind of icon or some kind of label in the music app that tells you at a glance, this is streaming and this is coming from your purchases. And right now, there's no visual indication that tells you the current song you're listening to, whether it comes from your subscription, that you're paying every month, or if it comes from an album or a single that you bought with your money. So
Right.
I think there should be a better visual communication of the source of the song you're listening to, and there should be a way to separate libraries between streaming content and locally downloaded or purchased from iTunes content.
Yeah, I can see doing that. I think the reason they don't, frankly, though, is because at least in Apple's view, it shouldn't have to matter, right? Whether a song is coming over the internet or the song is on your hard drive, it shouldn't really matter where it's coming from as long as it's the same song. The problem is, at least historically with Apple Music, is that sometimes those things are not the same, which is really what's gotten power users upset in the past, because sometimes, you have maybe a live version of a song or a cover gets confused with the version that you have on your disc that is what you really want to listen to.
Yeah, and in fact, local libraries and carefully organizing your music library is still a huge deal for a lot of people. I know that most of us, we have moved to just following Apple Music on Twitter and streaming the new releases from Apple Music's For You page, or listening to your favorites mix. I know that a lot of people do that. I do that. I don't manage my music library anymore. But still, for a lot of people, there's still a lot of folks that like to use iPods. Non-iOS device type of iPods. The old ones with the 30-pin dock connector.
Right.
Right. If you watch the movie, it's called The Baby Driver.
Mm-hmm.
That is still iconic. And there's still a lot of people that they like to have a separate music device without the overhead of a subscription, of caching, of streaming. You have a file, it's always there. You take the app or you listen to music. So I still think having a local music library is a big deal. I just don't think the way that Apple is dealing with two different types of music library is a good approach.
Thanks to Mutable for sponsoring App Stories this week. Mutable is a small team of experienced developers that focus on native mobile app development for iOS. They build their own products like the glitch camera Defect, that's DEFQT, so they understand the process from idea to App Store. Projects they have worked on range from SDKs to wrap public APIs, to Internet of Things network device management, and web RTC video and audio chat apps. They are skilled using lots of third-party integrations like AWS, Twilio, Stripe, PubNub, OpenTalk, Firebase, and a lot more. They even offer a complimentary Skype or FaceTime consultation to discuss your project. Thanks again to Mutable for supporting App Stories. So I think what we're talking about here, Federico, is a lot like what we've seen in the iBooks app on macOS, which is kind of strange to me because that app has been around for a while and hasn't received that many updates. But it really is very much in the model that we're talking about, because from that app, you can see your library of books, your iBooks that you've downloaded, and you can get into the store and buy new books, which is, I think, a lot like what you're talking about in terms of a music app or the podcast player even, which is already there, at least on iOS.
Yeah, and you can still drag in books that you have in your Mac, like EPUBs or PDFs. You can still manually add them, but it's a separate store, it's a separate app, it's a separate environment, and I think that works better for everybody. So if Apple were to get rid of iTunes, let's assume that they do a music app the way that I would like it to be. They do some kind of video solution that maybe encompasses TV shows and movies together. And we already have iBooks. And realistically, Apple is also going to do a podcasts app because it makes a lot of sense. There's podcasts on iOS, on the iPhone and iPad. It only makes sense to have a separate app on the Mac. And maybe they even do some kind of iTunes U client. And honestly, for iTunes U, we've seen the news of some parts of the system moving to podcasts and other stuff being exclusive to the iTunes U iOS app. Honestly, when it comes to the Mac, I wouldn't mind. And I also think it would be kind of smart to offer an iTunes U web app instead of a desktop app. Because with a web client, Apple could also target those people who have moved to Windows computers or Chromebooks. And so to sort of lure them back into the Apple ecosystem, they could make a web app. instead of a native client. Let's assume that Apple does a bunch of separate apps that each of them has its own purpose. How would Apple deal with the transition from a single unified location that is iTunes to multiple apps with functionalities split between them? The first obvious problem, I think, would be how do you sync your information? And I think for the default option for most people would be the way that it currently works on iOS. And the answer is you don't. As long as you're signed into your iCloud account on your Mac, all the stuff from these separate applications, all that data, it syncs with iCloud, and it's kept in sync between your iPhone, iPad, and MacBook. And so by default, I think iCloud would sync all of this information. You wouldn't have to think about it. But for those who want to sync data manually, I've been thinking about two possible scenarios here. So either the dedicated apps, they gain a standalone USB sync feature. So you go into iBooks and you sync just your books. And you go into movies and TV shows and you only sync those. So you need to selectively open apps and sync information. Or maybe the second approach would be, instead of having a single iTunes app that deals with content playback and with content organization and with content syncing, which are three major features rolled into one, maybe Apple could offer an iOS Manager app that reads data from these separate apps. And it's a thin client. It's a very simple to use manager that says, do you want to sync this data from these apps to your iOS device? And I know that the approach is kind of similar to iTunes. That is, you have multiple sources of data and then you have a sync manager. But I think the main problem is not that we have to click on menus and select what we want to sync. Is that the current model of iTunes, where everything is together into the same app, that is complicated. And I think people are more inclined at this point to open different apps and to sync stuff with iCloud. And then if you really want to, there could be either a new version of iTunes that has lost most of its functionality and it's only kept around for legacy and for compatibility purposes, or you open a dedicated USB sync manager and you just click a bunch of menus and you decide what goes into your iOS device if you don't want to use iCloud.
Yeah, we're right back to iSync again. I think it was called iSync, wasn't it, back in the day?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good idea, because I think having to open up different apps and sync one by one is a little bit cumbersome. And I guess what it doesn't, doing a separate sync app doesn't solve the problem of how do you deal with playback of local files. And what I think you could do is maybe beef up QuickTime a little bit, breathe a little more life back into QuickTime, which I know you're using to record this show. I mean, there's no reason you couldn't just play things through there. What it lacks, it's got the playback capability, but what it lacks is a way to navigate those files easily.
Yeah, exactly. And I know that a lot of people could argue in favor of iTunes. Why would you want to split up iTunes into multiple apps if you remove complexity from one place and you add it to another? And I think the main reason is, honestly, iTunes is just not a really well-designed app to begin with. It's just so difficult to use and explain. It's got a ton of craft that's been accumulated over the years. And I think the main advantage for Apple would be people are just more familiar with the standalone app model at this point. They know how to deal with multiple apps, whether it's music and podcasts and iBooks. iOS devices have changed our expectation of how media is managed. We know how to deal with multiple libraries in multiple places. And I think it's also the main point of this for Apple is that it's a better way to organize your marketing campaigns. You can say Apple Podcasts, you can say Apple Music, you can say Apple Video. You don't have to stay under the iTunes umbrella, because you can set up multiple entities within the company, multiple teams each of them having the unified Apple design language and Apple strategy, but each of them is separate. Each of them is unique. If you take a look at what Apple Music is doing with Carpool Karaoke, or if you take a look at what Apple Podcasts is doing with the featured shows and collections, those are two separate teams under one company. Instead, right now, iTunes is multiple teams under one app, which I think is more limiting. And I think it's an old approach that doesn't scale anymore.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think the problem is twofold. One is, as you said, it's a very old app, so it's old code and it's sluggish and it needs a major makeover. And the other is just it is confusing because you've got so many different media types in there that have very different approaches to how they market the media and how the media is even used, that it's made the app confusing and also hard to use. And breaking that up into individual apps would, I think, make a lot of that go away.
Yeah, and of course, there should be some kind of iTunes component that has to be kept around for all devices. For example, older iOS devices, like if you still have an original iPhone or an iPhone 3GS and it's still working for you, you don't want to and you cannot upgrade iOS, you still need iTunes, or you would at least need some kind of solution that is retrocompatible with that device. There's people with older iPods, there's people with older Macs. There has to be some kind of iTunes component that lives on. I don't know if that could be like a separate iTunes sync version that's buried into the utilities folder on your Mac. But I think eventually we'll have to move to this kind of setup where macOS and iOS have the same set of Apple Media apps, each with its own Apple branding. So Apple Music, podcasts, video, and so forth. And we'll move away from iTunes as the single place where we go to play, organize, and sync data. Instead, we'll have, for legacy purposes, some kind of device manager, because it's also important to remember iTunes currently deals with iOS backups, restoring an iOS firmware into a device. That functionality has to live on somewhere, but it doesn't make any sense to put it into iTunes. The same app that you use to listen to music can be used to flash an iOS device with a beta firmware. That doesn't make any sense to me. It seems like one of the greatest things about iOS is that it's taught us how to perform a specific task into a dedicated app. Because the app that you use does what you need and it doesn't do anything else. It's not like you open podcasts on your iPhone and you can watch YouTube. You have multiple apps for different reasons and different tasks to be completed on your device. iTunes on the Mac just feels like the way that we were using PCs 16 years ago, where you had a single app and everything went in there. And then you use cables to sync data back and forth between devices. We don't work like that anymore. We don't use our iOS devices like that anymore. So It doesn't make any sense to keep doing that 17 years later.
Yeah, iTunes, iOS devices are no longer accessories to the Mac. They're standalone devices. They can still act as an accessory, and you can sync them with a wire, but very few people do at this point. So one other thing we should mention too, Federico, that I know you and I have talked about before is it would be great if iTunes, at least the iTunes store, had some sort of web presence. So you could actually buy things on the web and they would just show up, whether that would be an app on your iPhone, a TV show on your Apple TV, or whatever, because I know I've enjoyed having this with a PlayStation where I can just go into Sony's store, buy a game, and it shows up on my PlayStation, whether I'm out on my phone somewhere away from home or wherever. And it's a nice way to do it without having to sit down at the device that you're going to use to listen to the media or watch the media, play a game or whatever it is. You always have the web with you in one form or another, practically with your phone or your computer, and that way you could use that to purchase items too.
Yeah, that is one of my favorite features from the PlayStation Store and also the Nintendo eShop. You can go on a webpage and you fill in your information and you buy a game from the web and it shows up on your device, on your video game console. I think there should be an extended Apple presence on the web with a way to have a web store anywhere you want, anytime you want. You go in there and you give Apple your money and you mark something as purchased, and eventually, depending on your download settings, it shows up on your devices. So far, Apple hasn't done any web stuff aside from web previews
Right.
for music and apps. And I think that should change, because it's much easier when you're not at home, when you don't have your iPhone, and you, even now, if you want to buy a Mac app from your phone, you can't. You gotta wait until you get home and you can open the Mac App Store. Again, it's more about, it's okay to have separate apps, but also from a web store perspective, it just makes more sense to me to have a single web store where you go with your account and you buy stuff and then it shows up on your devices. I would love Apple to do this.
Yeah, the more ways you give people to buy stuff, the more things they'll buy. I mean, just think of someone who works at an office and maybe using a Windows PC, God forbid, and they have a web browser and they can get into Internet Explorer and they could buy a TV show to watch it at home when they get home at night. I mean, that's a situation where that person might not buy that if they have to wait until they get home.
Yeah, especially if you can set things to download while you're away for 6 more hours. So
Right.
You don't have to wait until you get home to start streaming, and you already have your movie downloaded and ready to go.
Yep, I agree. Well, that's it for this week, Federico. Thanks again to our sponsors, Screens and Mutable. We'll be back next week with another episode. And as always, you can find both of us at macstories.net and on Twitter, where Federico is at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees, JOHNVOORHWES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.